ticking up to, we've got 40 participants now, so we might just get started. Just for those of you who've just joined, you'll notice that the session is being recorded and that'll be made available after the session. You have all been muted as well, and so if you want to raise some questions, please do so via the chat. Alrighty, so I'm going to get started. So good afternoon, and I can say that I'm generally saying good morning to everybody when it's good afternoon, but it's good afternoon today, and just thank you to you all for joining us for our discussion on fleet electrification, and if that's right for your organisation, it's fantastic to have you all with us. My name is Marita Mewett and I work with NettZero, who is a national sustainability consultancy. I'm very lucky to be talking to you today from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. We honour the wisdom of and pay respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge the cultural authority of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples across Australia. So over the past year, we've spent a lot of time working closely with organisations like your own to understand the baseline emissions of your organisations and to explore practical ways to reduce those emissions. One of the conversations that keeps coming up regularly is what are the opportunities that organisations have to lower their environmental impact? Now, for organisations with fleet vehicles, this area often represents the third largest emissions category, making it a really significant contributor to overall emissions. Therefore, it does make sense to investigate what impact a transition to EVs will have on your fleet and whether or not that's a good pathway to reduce your emissions. So that being said, we understand this journey can be complex. Where do you start? How do I know if it's right for our organisation? What are the impacts on my processes, on the way we work, on my staff, my other key stakeholders? Can I actually reduce the costs and emissions, and how do I demonstrate that to the leadership team who can allocate the budget? And that's exactly why we're here today. Reducing emissions across the board takes an ecosystem of experts with the right experience so that we can learn how to efficiently and effectively change the way that we work and reduce and improve our environmental impact. So joining us today is one of those experts, Landon, who is going to share his experience on transitioning to EVs and will provide some practical examples of what we need to consider. We've used a case study in today's session really to bring to life the various elements that you may experience through a transition to EVs. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat and we'll make those available at the end of the session. And as I mentioned at the top, the session is being recorded, so that's going to be made available afterwards. So I'm going to hand over to Landon now to delve into the detail. Thanks for joining us, Landon.
Thanks very much, Marita. And some of those questions you mentioned were questions that fleet managers ask all the time. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Thank you for having me on board. Excited to get into this. So I will just share my screen. Let me know once you can see that. Excellent, great. So before I jump into it, a little bit about myself and SolSombra. So my name is Landon. I'm the CEO and Principal Advisor at SolSombra. So we're a specialized consultancy that helps organizations on their pathway towards net zero, focused on energy and fleet. So we bring more than 17 years of experience in sustainability and energy industries to help our clients on that pathway. And so kicking off to understand who's on the call, so I can make sure that the information that we're going through is quite targeted. I'd just like to get some reactions from people. So first off, if you are in the EV industry or sustainability industry, could I get a thumbs up, please, in the reactions? Okay, great. And if you are in fleet or work around fleet, and you have some EVs in your fleet, could I get a heart? All right. And then if you in and around fleet, but don't have any EVs in your fleet, what's the next one? A clap or a raised hand? All right, great. And then if you're just generally interested in EVs or sustainability, now a raised hand or a smiley face. Great. Excellent. Fantastic. All right, so I will get into it, and so that gives me a bit of understanding. So what we're going to talk about today is a few things. So first is looking at the journey of transitioning your fleet, the benefits, the challenges, how to approach that, how to optimize fleet transition, and then of course the juicy stuff, the financial and environmental benefits. And as Marita mentioned, looking at this through the real world lens of a case study. As we go along, if you've got any questions, pop them in the Q&A, and we'll have a good chunk of time at the end to go through those. So I really want it to be an interactive discussion, hopefully. So the EV fleet transition journey. So it really is a journey. It's not something that can be done, in one go generally, and it's an important ability for organizations to make environmental and financial changes, which makes it really important for fleet managers, but it does come with its own challenges. So why does fleet electrification matter? So there's the environmental and financial benefits. So first, from a financial point of view, most people already know, you have the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, improved air quality, and ultimately public health. And as Marita spoke about, fleet can be up to a third of an organization's emissions, which is really significant. So it can have a dramatic impact on that pathway towards net zero. And then you ultimately have the potential for reduced whole of life costs. So that's how much the vehicle costs for the whole of its life with the organization. And that's something where there's a lot of debate around, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So in terms of what's out there currently, so we have hybrid vehicles, which have two motors, internal combustion engine, or ICE as we call it, an electric motor, a plug-in hybrid, which is the same but has a small battery and can be charged, battery electric vehicles, which are fully battery electric, and then hydrogen vehicles. So we wanted to assess the different options with a traffic light system to see current day, what does it look like, taking into account the variety of available vehicles, the potential for future vehicles, the emissions from driving those, the cost today, the ease to refuel, and then the resale value. So looking at hybrids, they are the most readily available, but from emissions point of view of these four, they are effectively the highest emitters, but from a cost, good value for money, easy to refuel, and relatively good resale value. Now, there's a lot more plug-in hybrids coming into the market, but currently there's not a huge amount of options, but that will change. Obviously, better emissions because of that electric element, relatively good from a cost and refuel point of view, and resale can be quite good. Moving to battery electric, so there are less options than hybrid, but more than the plug-in hybrids. But that will change, and there are more and more models coming, which we'll kind of talk to later. Emissions, zero tailpipe emissions, but your cost, ease of refuel, and resale value is why some organizations have question marks around it. Hydrogen is much talked about, but the availability of vehicles is very low. There's question marks around future availability, also zero tailpipe emissions, but costs, refueling and resale, again, are really big question marks too. Hydrogen from a passenger and light commercial point of view, it seems like that is not the pathway forward for the majority of organizations, but medium or heavy commercial, there may be hydrogen options in the future. So moving into the common kind of challenges and how to overcome them, there's really 5 key challenges, which is range anxiety, charging infrastructure, vehicle availability, upfront costs, and shifting behavior. And so with each of these, there are ways to overcome them. And as time passes, it's becoming less and less of a challenge. And I'd mention Norway, which is considered one of the leading EV nations globally. They've got over 20% EVs, and 90% of their sales are new sales are EVs. And Norway actually has many similarities to the Australian market, and they've overcome a lot of these challenges. So I would see Australia following a similar pathway. As adoption increases, there is more charging infrastructure, there is significant growth in the number of chargers being installed, more vehicle options being available, reducing costs. It would be easier and easier to overcome these challenges. But one of the key ones is actually shifting behavior. And so an example there is the Red Cross, which has implemented a number of EVs in their fleet. One of the key challenges that they had is actually human behavior. And that caused a bit of a failure in some of the uptake and the success of the EVs in their fleet, because ultimately it fell down at a human at the end of the day having to understand the best way to use the EV and charge the EV. So in terms of the approach to fleet electrification, there's really a step-by-step approach that we suggest. So it's nine steps, starting with goals and pathway, and that's really understanding the objectives of your organization. Is it around sustainability, cost? Are there other objectives? And setting a clear timeline. Once you understand that, what data do you have access to begin the transition? And if you don't have a good amount of data, then incorporating that in your process. Needs and operations. This is really understanding your fleet utilization, vehicle types, range, requirements, and operational needs, and then the use cases for potential EVs. Then moving into transition options is understanding what available options there are to transition your vehicles, and the compatibility, and then that whole of life cost. Then into infrastructure, so that's really understanding your locations, the suitability to charge at your locations, where are the cars parked or vehicles parked, and then what is the makeup of your charging, and considering scalability. Then transition planning, so that's what we suggest is a phased approach for EV transition. Moving into piloting and testing, our recommendation is always to pilot, test, learn from that, monitor, and then bring that feedback into your plan. Training is one of the areas that's often overlooked, and as I kind of mentioned about the Red Cross, it can be pivotal in the success or failure of a transition. So that is something that's really important. Then optimization and rollout, and that's bringing all of the data from the pilot, the training, and how you actually use those EVs to optimize and scale to the next steps of your transition. And we will touch on each of these with the case study and what they what their approach was. So starting off with goals and pathway. So that is, what goals does your organization have in place that may provide a structure? So if you have sustainability goals, that will be very different if you don't. Similarly to if you have any net zero commitments. So those are two really strong things that are driving EV transition, and a lot of councils are taking up EVs because of those strong commitments that they've made. And so for this, the case study that we've mentioned, so that is for a not-for-profit organisation based in Perth. They've got over 200 vehicles, and their guidelines is a 40 to 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2040. So that gives a very clear pathway as to the desire for them to make the transition. So in terms of data, generally what we see, there's three kind of types of data. Good would be odometer readings and fleet register. Then better would be taking that plus fuel card data. And then best is telematics and fleet management as well. If you don't even have odometer readings or fleet register, then that's the place that you start to be able to, okay, what do we need to gather the data to assess our vehicles? So from the case study, the breakdown of their fleet, they had 221 vehicles, 99 passenger, 108 SUVs. So for most organizations, those would be grouped together in passenger, but for this organization, they separated them. 12 light commercial and 2 heavy commercial. So it's important to understand the breakdown of your vehicles, and that can be the first place for you to understand, okay, well, at the moment, passenger vehicles are the easiest to transition generally, dependent on a number of variables, and go from there. So across their fleet, they had fuel card data, so there was a good amount of data available, driving almost 2 million kilometers per annum. That resulted in about 170,000 litres of fuel, 272,000 cost per annum, and almost 350 tonnes worth of CO2 from that driving. So what implication does that have for an organisation? Marita, I'll hand back to you to kind of give an insight from the carbon point of view.
Thanks, Landon. I think just, quickly to consider the data that's here, I think one thing that we sometimes forget about is if you've set a target like the one the case study to be net zero by 2040, is the cost of offsetting those emissions. And so making sure that you understand, like, of that 348 tonnes, if you've set yourself an internal carbon price, for example, say $45 a tonne, that's approximately 17K per year. And, maybe you're considering going to market and purchasing Australian carbon credit units, which are anywhere between $15 and $60 per tonne. So it can represent, a decent cost to the organisation every year. And obviously, as you transition, then those costs to offset are going to be reduced. So I guess that's another implication of the benefits of being able to transition your fleet.
Yeah, that is a very significant consideration. One thing I'll just reiterate, so there is the Q&A button. So if you have questions, feel free as we go to pop them in there. We'd love to answer questions towards the end. So moving forward from data is needs and operations. So here what you want to do is identify that the fleet roles and operational requirements, so vehicle sizes, their range, their load capacity, evaluate peak usage times, distances traveled, vehicle downtime, and where they're located. Then if there's any specific considerations for specialized vehicles, do they need cooling or anything like that? Heavy vehicles, that can be more specific. And then really important, which is often overlooked, is stakeholder requirements. So understanding user and operational requirements for a large organization. You may have a fleet manager, sustainability manager, facilities manager, executives, CFO, and then ultimately the people driving the cars. So all of these stakeholders should be involved in the process, because if there isn't alignment across one, then there is more likely for potential challenges as you scale. So in terms of the case study, as I mentioned, most of the vehicles were passenger vehicles used to transport staff to clients, sites, and commuting. They're driving between 16 to 30 kilometers per day on average. So that is quite low, but the majority of cars had low kilometers. So that may be something where other organizations it is much higher. And they were mostly kept overnight at various work locations and employees' homes. So these are really key considerations to understand. As an example, if average ranges were 300 kilometers a day, then that would make the transition very different to 16 to 30. So in terms of looking at the suitability of the options, so what I wanted to portray is where we've come from and where we're going. So breaking down the different categories, passenger, SUV, light commercial, heavy commercial. So last year, there was really a handful of passenger and SUVs, a few light commercial, no utes, and very minimal heavy commercial. Whereas fast forward to now, 2024, you've got all of the ones we had in 2023, plus at least a handful more, in some cases 10 more. From a utes point of view, there are significantly more options now, so hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and some fully electric. And on the heavy commercial, a number of companies that have really good EV options listed there. In 2025, we're expected to have more than 25 brands that have EVs. So the available options will continue to significantly increase, which makes it easier and easier to have options for various vehicles. So in terms of the case study, so the idea was to pilot trials with 10 passenger, 10 SUVs, 2 light commercial and no heavy commercial, because there are still less options in the heavy commercial, and it is best to try a number of different options to test costs, range, efficiency, and how they're used within your organization, because you may find that a slightly more expensive EV, which has better range or efficiency or some other features, provides a better outcome for your organization. So testing a number is good, and these are the ones that they decided to test. So charging and infrastructure, again, this is something that is often not taken as seriously as it should. To charge, say, 5 EVs at a site with 1 or 2 chargers, not really that big of an issue or concern. But if you have a large fleet, and as you start to charge 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 vehicles, then you really need to be strategic with your infrastructure and charging approach. So the first thing is the location. So understanding where your depots or where the vehicles are housed, where they're used, that's really important. Then the actual infrastructure at those locations. So what capabilities there are to install chargers and how many chargers. Also as well, if you're going to incorporate home charging, that is another level of consideration, having to install chargers at employees' houses, and we'll come to that in a moment. Exploring fast charging networks. So there are a number of fast charging networks that can facilitate transitions and make it easier to charge vehicles, and that can also help to minimize downtime, and then making sure you're always thinking with the future in mind. So scalability with EVs is really, really important. So having that kind of 1 to 2 steps ahead thinking can make it a significantly less cost in the future. So in terms of the case study, so they decided to install 1 dual port, so meaning you can charge 2 cars at the same time, 22 kilowatt charger at 5 of their sites with static load management. So what that means is basically limiting the potential charge to make sure that it doesn't use too much energy based on the demand of the site. And then their focus was around public charging. So rather than going and installing chargers in the employees' houses, using for example, the ChargeFox network, which has 193 chargers around Perth, plus RAC's chargers and the EV Highway in WA, as their way to optimize their charging. And so this is a view of where some of the charges are in Perth, and because the fleet is spread around, that's really important to consider. And so that was the first option, is charging through the ChargeFox network there. The other consideration was at-home charging, and so what was considered was, as an example, charging as a service via JetCharge. So that is not necessarily have to going and spend all this money to install chargers. Rather, it's pay as you go, and creates a little bit more simplification. And so there are different options there, but that's an example of one of the considerations. Now moving into the transition planning. So 4 key things here is to develop the roadmap, your timeline, priorities, and costs, and then prioritizing vehicles that are more feasible or have less of an operational impact, and stage the rollout. One of the things that's not really done is integrating fleet transition into broader organizational energy strategies. And so again, if you have a significant fleet, or even if you don't have a significant fleet, charging EVs can have a big impact on electricity costs, increasing your demand. So being across that is really important. And then planning your funding and budget for EVs and infrastructure, making sure you have a pathway for that. So in terms of the case study, as we mentioned earlier, it was around 10% of their fleet piloted, and in parallel developing a full EV transition plan, which would cover feasibility, emissions, charging, and a roadmap, and having that in place by the end of this financial year. So in terms of moving on to the piloting and testing, so number 1, conduct a pilot program, monitor the performance metrics. So this is things such as the range you're getting from the EVs, charging times, maintenance cost, gather feedback from drivers and stakeholders, which can help you refine your plans moving forward, and test various charging solutions. There's no one size fits all for charging. Different organizations, various different charging methods, at home, public, depot charging, or a combination may be better suited. And so from the case study, so they had volunteers put their hands up, as well as selecting various staff which had vehicles that were better suited to it, to participate in the trial. Look at the data on a monthly basis to compare existing vehicles to the EVs from a cost and emissions point of view, getting monthly feedback from drivers, and trialing that public charging with ChargeFox and seeing how that worked. From a training point of view, put in place trainings and protocols to give people the guidelines. EVs have different maintenance to ICE vehicles, so understanding that and making sure you have a plan for that. So generally EVs have less moving parts, so require less maintenance. However, because they're heavier, tires can be required to be changed more regularly. Collect as much data and insights as possible to optimize your rollout. And then one of the things that a lot of organizations don't do is they don't communicate progress and wins. And this is one of the key things to bring the organization on board and to foster a greater culture of acceptance around EVs. So really communicate, we now have this many EVs, we've had this much emissions reduction, and we're seeing really positive success. So for the case study, they had an initial training session, a 2 months lesson learned session to optimize based on the various learnings from various stakeholders, and then they decided to look at an e-learning platform as a broader rollout because it just wasn't scalable to be able to do training for 200 plus people as they rolled that out. And so moving towards the optimization and rollout, the key things to consider is using those pilot insights to then enhance the rollout, implement the transition in stages and monitor each stage and the readiness, Data is really key with EVs. You get a lot more data than you do with ICE vehicles. So monitor and evaluate performance and take those data analytics and use that to enhance the next stages of your plan. And as I mentioned before, celebrate milestones. That's something really, really important. So moving into the financial and environmental considerations, as I said, the juicy bits. So first we start with government incentives. So around the country, there are various incentives. So some rebates and some grants. So as an example, in WA, there's the zero emissions vehicle rebate. That's available for personal and business. There are also grants and various other funding. So an example in New South Wales is the New South Wales Electric Fleet Vehicles Incentive. So to explore what's available for your organisation, if you would like some specifics, feel free to reach out. Happy to have a chat around that, but they can make a significant impact into the viability for your organisation. Next is emissions, and this is one of the big ones, if not the biggest one. And this is really, really important. So a lot of people talk about EVs as zero emissions. That's not actually the case. So they have zero tailpipe emissions, but there is emissions that go into producing EVs as well as into the energy, if it's powered by the grid, the energy that powers the cars or the batteries effectively. So there are emissions from charging, but it's getting cleaner and cleaner every year. And that's a really important consideration. So again, going to the case study, a lot of their vehicles were SUVs. And so this is data from the Electric Vehicle Council. They suggest that it's approximately 50,000 kilometers to pay back the embodied emissions, the emissions to produce the EV, which is higher than a petrol or diesel vehicle. So 50,000 kilometers of driving the EV to reach parity in terms of the embodied emissions, and then it's emissions positive, so it's lower emissions than the ICE vehicle. Now, as I said, that's getting lower and lower every single year. So a comparison from the case study, so for one of their vehicles, if they were charging that in 2020, that would have generated about 1.8 tons worth of carbon. In 2023, same amount of charging would have generated 1.4 tons. So that's a 23% reduction in 3 years. So the grid is getting cleaner and cleaner because of the amount of renewables that are coming online. And so that's one of the key considerations for EVs is no matter what, your EV, charging it and driving it is going to get cleaner as more vehicles, more renewables come online. And then you can consider moving to on-site renewables. A lot of organizations already have solar, and as well looking at 100% renewable energy, and then that drastically changes the picture. So that payback period comes down significantly. So to look at this real world example on a fleet of 221 vehicles. So the current ICE fleet per annum fuel costs approximately 272K, maintenance costs about 135, and emissions of about 350. If you were to transition 100% of the vehicles, which you wouldn't do that in one go, but you'd be looking at a 62% reduction in potential fuel costs. So that's the cost of the electricity to charge the vehicles, potentially 32% reduction in maintenance cost, and 39% in emissions. So those are pretty significant. Now, if you were to look at public charging, and some of the public charging networks like EV are powered by 100% renewables. So then your fuel costs are only at 13% lower. Your maintenance cost stays the same, but you can see the emissions is 100% reduction because it's powered by 100% renewable. So understanding what the goals and objectives are is really important as well, because different organizations will view this differently. Then one of the other key considerations and much talked about is the whole of life cost. And so often it's a 5-year period. And this is much debated, and there's a lot of conjecture around this. And so I'll look at two vehicles, Mitsubishi Outlander, which is in the case study fleet, there are a number of these, versus the BYD Atto 3. And so taking a 5-year look, you have a total cost of almost $49,000 versus just over $50,500 for the Atto 3. So it's about $1,500, $1,600 more expensive, whole of life cost over the 5 years, so 3%. But the Outlander has 41% more emissions over that time. And so again, coming back to what is the most important for your organization, to understand that can help drive understanding. A key thing in whole of life cost is the resale value. So currently for EVs, there's a lot of question marks around batteries, battery life, and therefore the resale value around that. And so according to kind of industry standard Red Book, the resale values in the future are much lower than ICE cars. And in a lot of people within the industry are of the belief that that will change over time as there is more data. And to give you an insight, if the resale value of the Atto 3 was to decrease at the same trajectory as the Outlander, the whole of life cost would actually be $11,000 lower. So that shows you how much of an impact that the resale value or forecast resale value has. And in our view, that will definitely change over time. So if you are interested in getting some insights, if you're planning a pilot, we can kind of give you some strategies to optimize that. If you've already got some EVs and thinking what's next, we can certainly talk to you about optimizing that and helping to reduce costs and improve the performance. And if you're looking at a plan or a roadmap, that's certainly something that we can help you with as well. So in conclusion, electrifying a fleet it's challenging, but is a necessary step that we do need to take. And so following some of the guidance and the best practice that we've suggested can help to really smooth out the transition and make it more successful. And ultimately our suggestion is to be strategic and test, learn and refine through the transition. It shouldn't be a static process. So that pretty much wraps up the content that I wanted to share that Marita and myself worked on. So at this point, happy to jump over to Q&A. I've got our contact details up, so if you've got any specific questions you wanted to do or wanted to have a chat, please feel free to reach out to us. We're certainly happy to have a chat with any specifics. So Marita, I can hand back to you.
Thanks, Landon. That was excellent. Yeah, absolutely. I like the practical way that we've been able to demonstrate the data that you need to be able to, make the decisions whether EVs are right for you. We have one question in the Q&A. What are the emissions in creating an EV vehicle over the ICE vehicles?
That's a very good question. So I'll go back to this slide, this graph, and so this graph shows some of those what's included in the embodied emissions. So ultimately, you've got the process of if you take a lithium-ion battery, so extracting those minerals from the earth, converting it, building the actual battery, manufacturing the battery, manufacturing the car, transporting the car, and any other associated emissions with that. And so from the day that you purchase the car, if it's a battery versus an ICE, there are greater emissions on the ICE side of things, and it also depends what type of vehicle it is. So there's no exact, this is what it is for EV versus this is what it is for ICE. It's different for different vehicles, and so I would suggest to check out the Electric Vehicle Council. They have this calculator on their website, and you can go put in different vehicles, and it can show you the differences between them.
And we will pop one in the chat as well that comes from the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership based in the UK. But maybe if we've got that link that that you talked about, we'll pop into the chat as well. So another question that's come in from Linton Tuck, can you talk more about the options for home charging? How do you pay employees for electricity used?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So home charging is more complicated. There are services out there that so charging as a service that give you that all-encompassing package. So using a smart charger, are able to see how much is being used and what the potential cost for that is, and then you can reimburse that. There are other ways to do it as well. So not an all-encompassing package where you can procure the smart charger, install that at your employee's site, and then using that software be able to see what was used and reimburse your staff at a pre-agreed rate. It does create challenges because different homes will have different electricity costs, so that's definitely a consideration. And then there are certain other companies that are working on other solutions at this point. But if home charging is a good strategy for your organization, it's worthwhile looking at a number of different options and understanding what works best for you and your staff, but it's definitely more complicated than some of the other options.
And I think, Landon, one of the things that we were talking about earlier before we got on the call was around, staff moving in and out of your organisation and how do you deal with any infrastructure that is placed in their home. So as Landon said, it's more complicated. And so you kind of have to think about the life cycle of the employee as well. So thanks for that question, Lyndon. Next question, what happens to batteries in old and aging vehicles? Is it a ticking time bomb for the future?
That is a very good question. So in terms of battery technology, it has advanced rapidly over the last few years, and it is continuing to advance. One area that hasn't advanced as much is recycling. However, there are a number of organizations that are at the bleeding edge of that, and even in Australia itself, there are a number of organizations that have raised significant funding to commercialize recycling of batteries. An example of something in play already is Nissan is reusing some of the batteries of their Nissan Leaf vehicles and repurposing them after their warranty is finished for commercial storage. So for businesses, putting all those packs together and actually selling commercial storage. So there are reuse options, and then there will be more and more recycling options as well. But yes, it definitely is a consideration. But a lot of hybrids that have been around for a significant amount of time. So Toyota has been producing hybrids for 20 plus years. There are still batteries from those vehicles that are still going. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have your battery die in 5 years. I think that the technology will continue to improve, and we'll have more and more options for recycling in the future.
So thanks for that question, John. It's kind of one that kind of where you started to go into from Pablo, Landon, is, do EV batteries need to be replaced over time, 5 or 10 years? I think you've kind of talked about that. It is improving, but there is a replacement cycle.
Yes, certainly. So again, it comes down to what is the replacement cycle for the fleet as well. So if you're looking at, say, a 5-year replacement cycle, most EVs would have a warranty that is longer than 5 years. So that shouldn't be a concern. But generally, sort of the 8 to 10 year range is when a lot of batteries are expected to be replaced, however, or the warranties finish. However, having said that, as I mentioned before, a lot of the batteries still last significantly longer than that, but that is a consideration, the whole of life cost. So if you were looking at a 10 or 15 year horizon on whole of life cost, then you would factor that into it.
Thanks, Pablo, for that question. Another one coming from David. Are there any security issues when charging vehicles at the workplace? Like, for example, does the car need to be 100% secure?
So I'm not 100% what you mean by secure, but I can talk to a few different things. So in terms of charging, so when you plug in your vehicle, there are actually a lot of chargers now that can authenticate via the vehicle and activate charging based on that, and we're moving more and more towards that. So as an example, the EV charging network, they have that functionality now. And so security of EVs and EV charging will be far superior than actually ICE vehicles, in terms of if you had, say, a fuel card where someone can just take the fuel card and use that. But there may be different security considerations, which I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but generally they're very secure from a charging point of view. One thing I'll mention quickly as well is you can also limit who can charge. So if, for example, you had a charger at a workplace, and someone who didn't work at the workplace came up and plugged their car in. So most chargers, you can limit usage via RFID cards or via an app or the car authentication, and so it won't charge that car.
Perfect. So there's a question that's come through from Molly that I think a lot of people have got as well. Are there any performance differences between city driving and highway driving when it comes to the EVs?
Yeah, fantastic question. So ICE vehicles are generally more efficient highway driving, whereas EVs are not actually. So most EVs have what's called regenerative braking. So when you brake, it actually recharges the engine. And because you're doing that less on highways, so the actual battery utilization is higher than city driving. So that comes back to the needs and operations of your vehicles to understand that. So if you had a vehicle that was driving, say, 300 kilometers a day, but a lot of that was freeway driving versus city driving, then that would be a different consideration, and you would rather transition the city driving vehicle before the highway driving vehicle if you were choosing only one to transition.
Okay, perfect. David did clarify he was really looking about the vandalism if the car park isn't secure. So that was his comment from a security perspective.
So yes, that is a really good consideration. So a number of clients that I've worked with, they've actually provided EV charging facilities for their clients or customers or patrons. So for example, clubs and pubs, and that's one of their biggest concerns is around vandalism, and that's something that is very hard to stop. And so what a lot of public chargers do is they don't actually have a cable, because that's the easiest thing to vandalize or to break. And so you, for some chargers, need to bring your own cable too, but that will generally be specified in the charging app that a cable is required.
There's another question from Greg that's come in around charging stations, and can you use any of them, or is it brand specific? E.g., can you use a ChargeFox card and an NRMA PowerPoint charge point?
Yeah, really good question. So some of the different charging locations that are not ChargeFox locations are on the ChargeFox platform, but effectively at the moment, to use if it's NRMA or ChargeFox or EV, and there's lots of different ones out there, you generally have to have an account or an app with that particular provider. And so that is one of the challenges, is having 5 different apps. But from an organizational point of view, to find the public charging that's best suited to your organization, trial that, And so, as an example, ChargeFox, they do provide key fobs, RFID cards, and so you would then limit the charging to ChargeFox charges to simplify it. But again, you need to understand what works best for your organization.
That kind of feeds into another question around that piloting. You talked before about looking at the ways of working that we can consider. Are there some examples that you have around that? And it might, in regards to the charging questions that have come up as well.
Yeah, sure. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. So just to clarify, in terms of piloting different vehicles and charging options?
Yeah, I guess piloting your transition into starting to use EVs, and you talked particularly about changing the behaviour, and so that kind of flows through to the way that we do our jobs. So is there some kind of tips and tricks or things that you've seen work with regards to the way that people work and do their jobs that kind of help with the process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so a lot of this is really interlinked. So it's piloting, it's training, it's feedback, systems operations, but a really good example. So for this organization, as I mentioned, a lot of their driving is to their client sites, and they do a number of clients in a day. So would be training that particular driver, that particular employee to say, okay, when you plan your day, you stop for lunch for an hour, look at the platform, see where the nearest charger is, and go charge while you're having your lunch, so it doesn't actually impact the operations. And so starting to those sorts of things. For this particular organization, based on the amount they travel, you wouldn't need to charge every single day, but just say, for example, you did have cars that were driving significant kilometers, then that would be a really important consideration. It may be that some cars only need to charge once a week, depending on how much they drive.
Perfect. That's all the questions that are coming in. We've got 5 minutes left. Is there any other final questions people have got? Give another couple of seconds for those to come through. But a great lot of questions, and I think, Landon, in terms of giving people the idea of what data that they need to start thinking about how to transition and some of the ways of working, and I think a big call out around communication and training is really important with any change. Trying to bring people along the journey with you is really important to make sure it's successful. So I think that's an excellent call out that you've given everybody today. I don't see any more questions coming in, so I might wrap it up. Massive thank you to you, Landon. Really great insights. Excellent to be able to share the experience that you have with people around the virtual room here. At NettZero, we're really keen to help organisations understand and measure the emissions with the aim of setting targets that are achievable and that can be demonstrated via robust data, and help you to decarbonise your operations. So we like to work with partners like Landon to help our customers with key initiatives like this one. So we're going to continue to bring you information and sessions like this to kind of build that ecosystem and help you progress towards your targets. So we hope you found this session useful. Landon, any final words from yourself as we wrap up?
Firstly, thank you for having me, and it was really great to have this discussion, and thank you for everyone for your time today. Really appreciate that as well, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or in the future want to kind of discuss it. So yeah, thank you very much.
Maybe put up that last slide again so that people can get the contact details, and we will be sending out an email. We'll have the contact details on there with the recording and the slides. If there are any other sessions on topics that you'd like to hear about, please drop me a line. We're really keen to, as I said, build that ecosystem out to help you all with your journey. So with that, we'll close the session. Thank you very much for your participation. The questions were absolutely brilliant, and for your time, and have a great rest of the day.